Hey, welcome back to A Level Deeper. My name is Chad Miles. I'm going to be your host and conversational tour guide today, which I think is just a really fancy way of saying I'm a 29-year-old dude who lives in a van, travels the country, and just really likes having deeper conversations. And that's really just the essence behind why I started this show in the first place, was to be a conduit to those deep conversations. And today, I get to share a conversation that I had with a new friend, Jeremy Mitchell. I was introduced to Jeremy through my mom, actually, who had attended a seminar a couple of weeks ago where Jeremy was presenting on the Positivity Project. And we'll talk more about what the Positivity Project is, how that fits into Jeremy's story, and so much more in this episode. Really, the reason I wanted to have Jeremy on the show was that as my mom was describing this seminar and this presenter, who happened to be Jeremy, she was talking about this idea of positive psychology, and that piqued my interest. So often we hear about the negative side of psychology, and we hear about different disorders that people have, and working through what we might classify as being wrong with people from a psychological standpoint. But what about talking about what goes right with people? That's kind of the idea behind positive psychology, and Jeremy's going to talk more about that in the Positivity Project today. And it's all part of this identity that Jeremy has built around the idea of serving others. It started in his time serving in the military, in the U.S. Army, making a transition into becoming a teacher, and then becoming a principal. And that's when he was introduced to the Positivity Project and making a larger impact on the social and emotional learning of kids in schools. In this episode, Jeremy and I dive into both the work that he does and also his personal story, why he made some of the decisions that he's made in his life. And it's always just so interesting to me hearing the different paths that people take and how they go about making pivotal life decisions, making big changes in their lives. And we talk about how he came to some of these decisions that he decided to ultimately pursue in his life. And I think you're going to really enjoy that part of our conversation as well. And then lastly, as we talk about the Positivity Project, the power of positive psychology, we have a fun conversation around how these concepts should be taught in schools more. And we talk about the level of receptiveness that schools have towards this work. And so all of that is coming up on this episode of A Level Deeper. So go ahead and sit back, relax, tune in your speakers or headphones or phone, or whatever the heck you got. And I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jeremy Mitchell. Jeremy, it's always fun as you kind of look people up and are surfing on people's social media profiles. In the marketing world, a lot of times we encourage people to have bios on their social media that are very robust, and they talk about all the specific things that people do, and maybe they build credibility and they have links and they do all of these different things. And your bios on your social media platforms that I saw were a different approach. They were very simple, and they included two words: serving others. I want to start here because I'm just curious as to this idea of serving others. We'll get into some of your professional background, the work that you do. Talk to me about this concept, serving others. Why is that important to you? Why is that what you've chosen to broadcast about yourself?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I think I have gone through different evolutions of what that social media bio says, right? And yeah, I think simple is better in any shape or form, but really it's taken from some of the work that maybe we'll talk about later with the Positivity Project, and maybe how we got connected at first. But really just believe wholeheartedly that that's the secret to joy and happiness. That in a world today when things can be very self-centered, and that our own egos can be so important to us. And here I am with you talking about myself most of this time. I bet having a either intentionally or trying to at least even reaffirm my own self of what's important, and guide my own self. The idea that serving others really is the key to joy and fulfillment and happiness. And oh, by the way, it does a lot of good for others too. So that's where that comes from for me. if someone wants to know more, they'll start digging anyway, right? But at least if I'm going to tell the world who I am right away, like, all right, that's my focus. It really is. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about the process of coming to that conclusion. That's a pretty powerful statement, you know, that joy and happiness is built upon serving others. How did you come to believe that in the first place?
Yeah, it's a connection through a friend who's now very close colleague as well. So his name's Mike Irwin, who would be a great guest for this podcast, and he's been on others too. Mike is the reason I came across the Positivity Project. He's a pretty upstanding human, and he happened to be a fellow Army officer who does other good things in the world, and he studied at the University of Michigan. And his professor of positive psychology, who essentially is the catalyst to a lot of things that Mike has done, and now I've been lucky to be involved in too, Chris Peterson, he had boiled down the philosophy of positive psychology down to 3 words, and the idea that other people matter. And anything you can do to build a relationship or connect with another human is ultimately going to make you and them better off. And that really, like, they codified positive psychology across the world, across time, across cultures in these 24 different character strengths. And essentially he said, you know, those character strengths are important to that human's character to build relationships with another. And really, like, that's what the world needs more of, is relationships, because it overcomes so much. And I've seen that play out in my own life as a team member, as a leader, as a spouse, as a dad, and something that I'm constantly trying to get better at every day, right? And fall short of every day. But that's how Chris used to explain positive psychology. I mean, there's literally a video of him, he's passed since 2012, but saying that, like, if you don't have an hour to listen to me talk about positive psychology, listen to these next 3 words. And that's carried over through in so many other research projects, whether it's the Harvard study on longevity, this idea that, like, people in their golden years, the ones that are thriving are the ones that have been able to, you know, evolve as a human into different relationships and sectors of defining who they are, and having close positive relationships, especially when humans are hard, right? So how do we get better at that, right? And so that's where some of my work in the schools has happened, with this idea of, one, just being an educator and a leader, but then the idea of, like, how do we get better at that as a society, right? And there's a lot of bad stuff in the world, and that's what traditional psychology focused on, right? Is disorder. And positive psychology seeks to find and define order, and relationships with humans is key to that. So yeah, that's the genesis of that.
Okay, so I want to come back to later on in our conversation. I want to come back to the Positivity Project, and I want to come back to some of these ideas that you're talking about around positive psychology and positive relationships. For you and for your story, you know, this idea of serving others seems like it started many years before you found the Positivity Project, going all the way back to serving others in the form of serving our country, serving in the U.S. Army. It seems like this has been a consistent part of who Jeremy Mitchell is, serving in some way, long before you found the Positivity Project, or maybe even existed.
Yeah, I mean, to date myself, I'll be 40 in July, right? So 80s baby, and I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. So, I mean, I remember walking into a class and the TV was on, and, you know, we were watching that play out in real life. And, you know, I've always been a history buff, and I heard my parents talk about the day, you know, John F. Kennedy was shot, and, you know, I learned about Pearl Harbor and didn't quite understand the depths of it, even, you know, sitting in a high school social studies class before any of that. But, you know, I don't know if I knew what I wanted to do then, and I still don't know if I know that now, by the way. But I just was deeply affected by it, like so many others, right? And I don't know, it was like, when I've had to talk about this before, it was like, you know, instant maturity that happened that day, to myself and many others that were, you know, young people, and then ultimately later, like, serving in the military because of that, really. Seeing other people, meeting other people that were just filled with this strong sense of purpose. And then I was, you know, fortunate enough to have had the right people come across my path and invest in me to make me want to be a leader, and literally be trained to be a leader, but also fail through and hopefully thrive through and learn through ways of leading people, especially in the military. The military is very good at teaching leadership, and the way they do that particularly is through practice, literal reps in leading people. And I don't think that you can be a leader if you don't have an other people matter or a servant mindset, at least not the good leaders I've had that I've served under. And then people I've studied from afar by reading and, watching. So yes, it definitely did. And I think more than anything is, again, that experiential nature of understanding what it means to serve others. And that it is what makes me feel the happiest, right? Like, and that's now I have some research on the background to justify that, right? This idea that like, hey, fame, wealth, achievement, those aren't the things actually that move the needle on people's, well-being and happiness actually. So, it's the right thing to go after, even if it is self-serving, right? And, we're all motivated by incentives, right? But I get a lot of joy in that. And like I said, I've never met someone who doesn't. So for me, it's about now how do you multiply that, right? Whether it's being a teacher and guiding and coaching young people to understand that, whether it's listening to your own podcast. And when I listened to your episode with Manny, right? This idea of like, you're like, well, I don't know if I'm like jiving with where I've ended up, right? Like I've been super successful, but maybe that's not really what's brought me some fulfillment. And it's a lucky place of privilege for all of us to be at, right? Where you can choose and say, I want to be what I want to be. And so that's maybe even why my bio is so short, right? That serving others. The joke I have with my wife is, my favorite movie for all sorts of reasons is Forrest Gump, right? But I just love that line. He's like, I just cut the grass for free. Like this is what I like to do, right? So that's kind of like the little colon after, right? I just want to cut the grass for free, do the right thing, So lucky to be able to really do that, actually.
Well, so obviously that's displayed in this decision. You talked about experiencing 9/11 and then having this sort of instant maturity type moment where I don't just walk us through, because that wasn't the path that I took in life, and I didn't go into service and serving our country. So I'm just curious to learn more about what that decision felt like for you. What was it about this kind of instant maturity process? What was it that appealed to you about going, serving our country, risking a lot? Talk us through what that decision looked like for you personally.
Yeah. It seems like if you got to give the elevator pitch of your resume, it is like, all right, 9/11 happens. And then I'm at like a recruiting office like the next day. And in some ways, like as I get older, it feels like that, but it didn't happen that fast, right? Like I was 17 when I graduated. So I was younger for my class, and yet I was still pretty close to it. But I don't know how it came about, but I remember actually reading, I don't know how you're 17, you end up reading this book, right? But I ended up reading Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, actually. And I always had a lot of admiration for service from others. And like, I know I'm a middle-aged white guy, and there's like so many jokes about that. Like, oh yeah, like they all want to be heroes in World War II, right? Like, or kind of the trends lately of like, how often do you think about the Roman Empire, right? Like, I don't know, twice a day, right? So like, I had that within me anyway, I guess. But like, and I remember playing like war as a kid, but I had an uncle who was in the Marines and in the Army, but I didn't really know him that well. And then my mom's brother, another uncle, was in the Air Force, and the same. He didn't really talk about it. So it wasn't like there was this, generational, warrior class in me that some families actually do have. But I think it was that like those inspiring stories that I was reading, and then something inside me was calling me to do this. And you're right. There was a lot of risk being involved. And so I remember actually like seeing and walking past, because it was clearly my mother was like, you are going to college. I don't care how much you don't want to, or you want to try to do something like this overnight. And so I went to college, and they had an ROTC department there. And I had a friend who was kind of involved, and then I found out more about it, and that you could enlist in the National Guard at the same time, and then also like finish college and become a leader as an officer. And then I just started to get to know other people, and I felt like these were some of the most motivated people I had ever met in my life. And I had been an athlete. I played football, and wasn't like the greatest athlete. I was a lineman. I was not out there like making big things happen. Like I remember explicitly being told, do not touch the ball. Like linemen should avoid it with the plague. So, but I liked the challenge. I liked working hard and doing something bigger than me, right? Like, and that's where that came from. And I experienced it. And then I feel like I was around, like I said, some of the most motivated people who were encouraging me to be better. And I don't know if I even truly felt that before, right? I definitely in athletics and in some school aspects, but to continue that challenge was amazing. And then, I feel very lucky that in a very scary way too, like people were like, all right, well, if you're going to do it, go be with the best that are doing that. And I even got to do that within the Army, right? I was not a special operator in that way, but people said, if you're going to go do this, if you're going to be a leader, you should fight to try to be an infantry officer, because that's where the best of the best are, right? That's the biggest, worst challenge you could take on. And there's a little bit of like smack talking that happens, of course, in the military between military branches. And then even within the branches, right, of like, what is your job? There's this kind of like, I'm better than you mentality, even though we are all on the same team. So I just felt like some of the things I had read as a historian myself of this idea that like, if you're going to go and fight people in a very scary place, you better go do it with people who are motivated. And I was with very motivated people the whole time that I was in the military. And I think that that's even part of like my story now of like my, most recent position with a veteran serving nonprofit, that the being around people like that has just been amazing. And I felt it too with educators, by the way. And in another job, I felt like that, I see that everywhere anyway, like something to admire, but I have definitely felt a homecoming of like, yeah, I remember those days and what that was like, and to be pushed by other people to be better. Right. So something that was so awesome about all that.
It's interesting to hear you make that connection to educators as well, because that became the next chapter of your journey, right? And it's interesting to hear you. I don't think that's typically a connection that maybe we would make, is that there's some resemblances between military and educators. Talk a little bit more about that and why that became the next path that you chose.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, and I'll echo it with maybe a connection of ours between you and I after listening to your story, is this idea of like, a thread of service, but a thread of being true to yourself and who you are as a person and what you want out of life. Like I said, it was interesting to hear you talk about having a pretty nice, slick job and, walking away. And so that's actually very similar to my story, and this idea of like, you're this person who's serving something so much bigger than yourself. And I got super lucky. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but the recession in 2008 was a big deal, right? And I got out of the Army in July of 2009. I mean, I literally had people telling me like, don't get out because you're not going to find a job. Actually, you should stay.
Wow.
So that was a risk too, right? And I was very lucky. I ended up working in a very fancy sales job selling medical devices for Johnson & Johnson, and it was very much a dream job that came with very nice compensation and fun trips and all this. And I probably got about 3-4 months into that, and one of my soldiers who had been in my unit before was killed in Afghanistan on the second deployment. And I had one of those moments of like, what are you doing? Right? Like I felt so, what's the word I'm looking for? I felt very guilty, I guess, about like living the high life that I was living compared to like friends I had still, rolling around in the dirt in Afghanistan and Iraq, trying to do big things. I also felt like I was just, serving self, right? Like that, as much as it, was luxurious, I just felt like this is not lighting my fire, and I've got to be true to me. And so I knew that I didn't want to go back in the Army. I mean, like I said, I'm happily married to my best friend, and I have 2 awesome kids, and that's a hard life on anyone to have a great family, especially at that time, right? People were deploying every other year, and spending a year more away from their families, it wasn't healthy in that regard. So, but I wanted to keep serving. And so I was lucky enough that, our country's made some awesome policies, and the GI Bill I never used to pay for education. So I was able to utilize the GI Bill. My wife's from Michigan. She's from a little town where I live now called Heartland, Hart. And it doesn't get more, American than that, right? It's right. She grew up in a house that's literally within an apple orchard, right? Spicer Apple Orchard. So I joke, my in-laws, they live in Apple Disneyland. They can wave at people on their little wagon rides. And we decided I would hit the reset button too. She was a teacher, and I had been kind of enamored by that. When we were dating, I would go to the school where she worked and I'd hang out and play with kids, and I liked doing that. And so I decided to go back to school on the GI Bill and went to University of Michigan, Flint, and got a teaching certificate, and luckily ended up doing something I really love, which is serving still, right? Because educators, police officers, nurses, like they're all cut from that same cloth of like, hey, it's you got to live for sure. You need some compensation, but like there's definitely a trade-off of like living your passion, and it's very hard work, just like being in the military. And I mean, being a teacher, I know what they say about the summers. You know, your mom's an educator. I know that's where this connection came from. Like you saw it growing up, I'm sure. It's like it doesn't stop, right? And you're now, those are your sheep, right? Those kids are your flock of, you know, people to be responsible for in many ways, because guess what? A lot of them don't get to grow up in the storybook life the way maybe some of us did. And they need that supporting adult. And so, and then I, you know, luckily in a very also tough time to find a job still in 2012, ended up working for a really awesome school district, and got to be a high school social studies teacher, world history, economics. I mean, it couldn't get any better than that. Just all the stuff I'd sit around and drink coffee and yik yak with anybody about for free, right? I got to be paid to do that and hang around young people saying ridiculous things, and just that service mindset, right? Got to continue. Like people who think that way, like I'm all in for what they want to do and want to support them too. You know, like if you can, just like your episode too, like if you can chase what it is that you want to do, more power to you, because there's enough people miserably slugging out doing things that they hate. Right. And I would just wish they had the courage or the opportunity to do what they want to do.
Yeah. I mean, that word courage is a powerful one, you know, because as you just talked about I think it takes courage to potentially give up or leave a situation that could be a very good one. And it can be providing a lot of value to your life. It sounds like that was part of your story. That was part of my story. And it does take an element of courage. You know, I talked about in a recent episode, I think it takes a lot of courage because you've got to sacrifice something, whether that's, you know, your level of comfort or your security or your stability or your status or whatever those things may be. It seems like when you're making a decision like that to pivot and pursue something different, there's some element of sacrifice. And I think that takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. And, you know, you look at your decision to pivot professionally, your decision to go serve our country, courage and sacrifice, right?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, we'll get into it later, I'm sure, but like the Positivity Project and the, you know, the 24 character strengths, right? Like bravery is one of them. And we talk about the nuance of that with kids as young as 4 or 5 years old, all the way up to, you know, seniors in high school and beyond. This idea of like, hey, bravery does not mean that you jump out of airplanes and, you know, go find bad guys, right? Like it does. That's one definition of it. But bravery means like calling up your mom or dad and telling them like, hey, I know that you poured your whole life into having like great things for me. And I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful when I tell you that I'm going to, you know, go do this instead, for like potentially risking a lot, right? You know, bravery is like you're sitting in a grocery store and somebody pulls a gun out and you act, right? Bravery is also taking a risk and you know, like you said, walking away, but also it's this idea like even loving somebody, right? Like choosing to love somebody that, you know, could be a risk, right? Like it happens in so many ways, shapes, and form. And so the idea of like spending my time on this earth, which is finite, right, and not guaranteed, helping others make sense of all that, right? Like, because it seems to me that there's a big problem, especially in this day and age. Like people are very lost, right, and really struggling with that. So I just love that our culture in general is leaning into that more and being open to the idea of it, like talking about that more.
I want to go back to you mentioned this feeling of guilt that you had after you left your time serving, and you were just seeing other people who were still serving. I'm curious about that transition, because again, it's not part of my experience. I can't say I have people close to me who did serve and then transition back into, you know, sort of civilian life afterward. Tell me a little bit more about what that transition period was like for you, where, you know, I mean, it's just going from, it seems like, an extreme as far as courage and risk and the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and then entering back into a whatever normal life means. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned I got out in 2009. I think, obviously 9/11's 01, Iraq kicked off hardcore in 03. It's so funny, like now looking back, we just, in a not very great way, left Afghanistan like over 20 years of war, right? And so in some ways, like even starting my journey, I felt like I was late to the party in many ways. Of like, I had friends later that like had served multiple tours in the wars before I even went to Afghanistan, right? And then I feel like I wasn't even in the military that long compared to friends who are now retiring after 20 years and what they've done and given over that time. So like even just saying it like that, right, is like, that happens, I think, in the military too, of like, I didn't do enough. I think that that's a real thing. And, obviously I know I did, and people like that I'm talking about like did, right? Like they did something more than a lot of people, right? But I also don't think anybody should be put on a pedestal for anything, right? Either, in that like that was just your choice and circumstance and it's necessary. But I think everybody carries that, especially when you've lost friends, right? Like I have all my parts and pieces, and I have friends that don't. And, I don't think they want me going around being all like, I didn't do as much as you because you lost a limb. I don't think they want handouts either. I think they do want support. I think they want, gratitude. But I definitely felt that. I felt like I got super lucky. I like fell in love with a girl who was like the woman of my dreams, and still, and had this, like I said, great job. And like, I had friends like literally like they redeployed in September, and like I said, my close friend of mine who I really looked up to at the same time, who was one of my NCOs, and it was a sniper, Tyler Juden, like literally was Facebook messaging with me 2 days before he was killed about how he was going to actually get out of the Army and become a teacher. Before I had decided to like be a teacher, I was working for Johnson and Johnson, and I was joking around, like my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, she's basically a professional cheerleading coach, and she was in college at that time, and like is a national champion like twice. And we were in Orlando like for the events, right? So like he's messaging me, and he's like, "Oh my God, you are at a profession or a national competition for cheerleading," right? And he was a young single guy, right? Like I said, who had deferred college and that kind of fun stuff to be in the military. And he was like a borderline like championship U.S. Army sniper. And then killed in 2 days later. So, I mean, it really like wrecked me for a moment. And so there's this idea of like almost like survivor's guilt type vibe that can happen with all veterans. I think, especially the veterans of, this time period and past, where they've been involved in a conflict. But then there's the transition period that I think we got much better at. It's still not perfect, but, even for me personally, it was like, that's the past. I just was like, psychologically, I'm gonna pretend like that's done. Right. I'm moving on. That's not who I am anymore. Yeah, sure. It's a part of me, which right, wrong, and different, I actually think was the right play for me. Like I needed to move to something else. So it helped, but I don't think it was perfect in like a sales role environment that I was in, where I kind of worked from home. I went to the offices of, doctors. I went to surgery. I think I was very good at that, but I just felt very lost of like, I'm not fulfilling my purpose, right? Like your story, it was actually very hard. I feel like I was like letting a lot of people down, or like squandering a big opportunity in many ways. And like, I was like, what are people saying about me? Like, would they think I'm like having like a nervous breakdown or something crazy like that? Like to hit the reset button like that, or to give up something so great. And, like you mentioned, yeah, in hindsight, there's courage that comes with that. There's self-awareness, and, I even recently went through a transition of like, leaving a wonderful school district with a great leadership opportunity there too, to do something that like calling on my heart even closer. Right. And so definitely felt like a ripple of life again, even within the last year of like, where are my feet supposed to be? And I guess I'm just glad that I've had the opportunity to choose like I want for others, but also then the self-awareness, the serendipity to be able to kind of shift to something that now like that lights my fire. And I don't say that to say like I've got to be on fire all the time, because I think there's definitely like times in life where you're like, no, you need to stick with something. Like it's important to stay committed. but then also being okay and moving on. So, everything is perspective, right? And as you get older, you get more of that too. And I'm lucky to keep sucking the lessons in for sure. So, yeah.
What's behind like this most recent decision to pivot and do something different professionally? It's a topic that I'm endlessly curious about is what drives people to ultimately make these changes and make these decisions. Walk us through some of what is Jeremy's formula for sort of recognizing, you mentioned words like courage, self-awareness. When you look at making a big change in your life, like you've made, it sounds like a few times, what are some of the indicators or things that lead you to ultimately decide this is the right thing for me to do?
Yeah, I think I still don't know the answer to that, I guess. I feel like all of us, you get almost like an itch that you can't scratch in some ways, or you feel restless a little bit, maybe. I've had other times where I think it's like that I maybe like, not mastered, but maybe like did something right enough to know like I need to be in a place where I'm uncomfortable now. I know that about myself. I think some of that comes from like my dad moved positions a lot, which caused our family to move a lot, and not due to military connections, but it helped later, I guess, for some of that. But almost like a little bit of a gypsy heart in some ways, right? That I know like makes me feel excited, and so I know that I like change and need change in my life, and find that in other ways when it's not just professionally. So I feel that. I think whether it's philosophy or whatnot, or moments in life that cause you to zoom out and see what's most important to you and those in your tight circle that you're responsible for, I think matters. At least this last iteration, I felt so strongly connected to that community. But I felt like I was at an inflection point where I'm like, I don't think this is, the future for me. And I don't also want to like waste those folks' time. I want the very best person to be in, say, the role I was headed toward. And the role I was headed toward is a very big, long-term committed position. And so that actually personally was one of the most tough things to do, to look. I'm so blessed to have so many mentors, actually, like, a good handful of people that have been poured into me and cared about me. And so to have a conversation with someone who's a close mentor and say, hey, you have been so good to me, but I have, followed you and tried to be like you in lots of ways, right? You've been such a great example, but I'm also not you. And I guess I'm not going to keep going on that same path. Like that was one of the most challenging things I've had to do recently. I'm happy to report that like, my former boss and I like have even gotten to lunch since, right. And seen each other since, and it's all good. And it was great. And that, I've gotten to now hitch a wagon closer to another mentor that, I look up to so much as well. And, I think that again, that itch that you feel like you can't satisfy, it's a signal. And I feel good that now we're talking in December after making, going through the process of kind of perseverating on it internally by yourself, and then you start talking to the people you trust the most about it, maybe, and get some advice. And then you finally kind of make that move that, I feel very affirmed by the choice that I've made. Just as I did feel when that Johnson & Johnson transition to being a teacher felt, and, even with at that time, an 80% pay cut to go be a public school teacher.
I've had a lot of conversations around whether we call it the gut, intuition, that itch that you're talking about. I feel like we can all resonate with that feeling, whether we've listened to it or not. I feel like most people have had moments in their life where they've just kind of, recognized I've got that feeling. I feel it somewhere. Feels like maybe I'm being pulled towards something different. It's one thing to recognize it, one thing to actually act on it and do something about it. So I commend you for that.
Sure.
I want to talk about this. Yeah, thank you. I want to talk about this path. So you come into teaching, and then there's this sort of like logical progression that I'm seeing, that you're a teacher, and it seems like you keep sort of moving up, I know, the ladder, but also moving into positions that have more influence over more kids and more students until you're working your way up to a principal. And then now, even as I see, your involvement in the Positivity Project, it just seems like there's greater chances to influence and impact more kids and more students. Has that been part of what's behind maybe that trajectory that you've been on over the last decade of your career?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting because it's like the zoom in, zoom out, right? It's the macro, it's the micro, right? Like, when I taught economics, there was a separate course for macro if you took the AP class, and then there's a separate course for micro, and I value both. I love the idea. I get annoyed by it being thrown around so much these days, like the word scale, right? Like everyone's talking about scale, right? Like sometimes I think businesses, they want to scale, because they think they're going to make the most impact, and yet if you do that too hard, too fast, you water things down too much, right? And I think that can happen in your own, personal trajectory too. So yeah, I think that like I got exposed. I never ever thought like going through high school that I was a leader, right? I was not that kind of kid. Like there are certain people you look to, they're like, yeah, that's like a born leader almost, right? Like they're the type of person that people will follow. And I didn't see myself that way. And I seriously now still like don't see myself that way, even though like I said, I've had a lot of chances to do that. Like I said, now I've refined my definition of leadership way more, right? Like this idea of serving others is like, you can never go wrong with that, even when you have tough conversations. But I think that's why that happened in schools, was that I had leadership experience, even though it was interesting. This is an interesting thing about veterans in general, right? Like I had more responsibility as a 21-year-old than most people will ever see in their entire lives ever, right? And like, yeah, it's very much like a sink or swim moment, right? Like this is on me, right? Like so serious to have this responsibility, and like just never lost that. Like I don't like excuses. Like if something needs to be done, like let's do it, right? Like what do we need to line up to do it, right? And I think a lot of people like can sit back and wait, and I'm not over aggressive. I'm very much like just behind that. But I've seen it happen, and I've been inspired by people who've made big things happen. And so I don't like it when people just want to identify a problem and then not actually do anything about it, right? So like let's do something. So yeah, definitely. I think that the foundation came from the military, and then it has been affirmed in other places, right? Like that's where I grew up as a leader. And then I think education actually does a very good job of talking about leadership, right? Like there's ways to come. Like I don't even like the name administrator, like in the school world. I'd rather just use the word leader, right? And get away from managerial type things, because anybody can manage. But like that emphasis on leadership of like, what do you do in a situation where, guess what? There's no rule book. There's not. And no one knows the right best way to do it. But can you, influence and organize people to figure a mission out in a positive way, right? And education got their war with COVID. Like everybody experienced COVID, but like COVID in the school setting is the Vietnam of schools of that time, right? You got teachers who were heroes one minute, and then they're villains year into this later, and they're dealing with all that and trying to be mom and dad and everybody and everything to everyone. And so to lead through that era was quite an interesting experience too.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Okay, Positivity Project.
Sure.
So I before we dive into some of like the principles behind it, I'm curious, what was the story in which how you got connected to the Positivity Project in the first place and started to bring this into your school district? What about it, appealed to you, or what about it spoke to you?
It definitely spoke to me then, especially knowing what it is more fully now. But even then, the idea of it. But essentially, this started with a Facebook post and liking the post, and then a very relationship-oriented, hustling guy who is my other mentor and leader at Team Red, White, and Blue, supporting veterans. And then he's the co-founder and a board member for P2. So Mike Irwin, and he got a couple books out. You should check it out. Lead Yourself First, one of them, and Leadership as a Relationship is another. So essentially, Mike put up a Facebook post about this in its infancy, and he tagged a guy that I was in Afghanistan with, and that was it. So I saw the post, and I'm like, what's Wes doing with schools? That's cool. I didn't think he was involved in that. I'm a veteran. I'm involved in schools. Like, I thought I was the only one. Like, cool. Like the post, move on. I started following it, and next thing you know, I get a message from Mike, actually. I think it was on Twitter, actually. And he sent me a message like, hey, Wes, you work for schools. Like, we need to talk. And it was cool. He ended up being in Michigan, actually. He lives in North Carolina, but was in Michigan doing actually some things with P2. And he's like, hey, let's meet up for a coffee. I almost didn't go, but I'm like, well, it seems like this guy's involved in a lot of cool stuff. And it'd be nice to connect with another veteran about like a school topic. And so that's how it all started. And turned out that Mike studied positive psychology, like I'd mentioned, and had done this work with veterans and Team Red, White, and Blue from that foundational basis. But then a friend of his who was a principal in Syracuse that actually they were like opposing baseball players as kids, was an elementary school principal, and basically him and another guy that grew up with him who was a teacher there were like, we need to use this stuff in schools. And so like they worked together and like whipped up like PowerPoint slide decks around these different character strengths, and they started it off. And so, I got the chance to talk about it with him and then bring it to my staff, and they were open. And next thing you know, myself and a couple of teachers met up with them at Syracuse University. We did some training on what it was and what it could be, and met teachers at that school. And we're like, yeah, this is a great thing. Like I think schools are doing a much better job at, this idea of social emotional learning or, deep focus on character now, but definitely like it was lacking in how robust it was then. And so we really got to be a part of something really grassroots, which was cool. So that's how that all came about. And really then it evolved into so much more. And the teachers got to be very involved in building this, right? Like all this content and curriculum that we talk about with kids is all current teachers made that. It's not a publishing company. It's not, anything very canned feeling. It's very generative. So that's been really great too. And watch that airplane be built as we were flying it in many ways. And that, my school and the school district I worked for got to be a big part of that and growing it. And it's still growing and super important to me that the kids have a chance to explore who they are and others at the same time. So, yeah.
Positive psychology. Introduce me to that idea as though I know nothing about it, because I don't.
Sure.
That's not a phrase that I'm really familiar with or understand. So what is this idea of positive psychology, and why is it important?
Yeah, so I'm imagining that you probably took an intro psychology class, at least. Like none of us are getting out of an undergrad without something like that, or high school, et cetera. And
yeah,
the history of all that is you come off World War II and all this heinousness, right, that happens in the world. And I mean, obviously Freud was even before that, but this idea of like all these things can go bad. Let's figure it out why these bad things can happen so that they don't happen again, right? So it's from this like, deficit mindset, right? There's a big, thick manual if you're a psychologist called the DSM-5 that outlines all the disorders that can happen in humans, right? And so these researchers, so Chris Peterson at Michigan, Martin Seligman at Penn, and their teams basically decided like, what about all the stuff that goes right? And I think they get like the story I heard was they all kind of got laughed at a little bit in like the academia world of like, this is like self-help guru type book, like shelf type stuff. And it's not serious, like social science. And they weren't really like treated fairly, I think, in that way, as I understand it and have come to know it. And essentially though, they said, hey, let's look at all this cross time, cross cultures, cross geography, cross religion, culture, and let's see all the things that are common in humanity that go well. And if it's not present in one, but it is present in another, like they threw it out. Like doesn't mean it's not important, but it wasn't unifying. And so these 24 character strengths that they identified, they wrote a huge thick book called Character Strengths and Virtues. That's essentially like the opposite of the DSM-5. And so positive psychology goes that. And Mike, even when we got trained in positive psychology from him, he had a picture on the slide that was very real to me. This idea of like, it's a Humvee that had been blown up in Iraq, and you see two soldiers just staring at it, and there's a big hole in the ground. And the narrative is that two people also in that Humvee died, and that you imagine these two guys experienced that trauma, and that they had come about like moving on from that trauma in very different ways, right? So the veteran community and like the greater world at large now wants to throw PTSD around quite often, right? You see many people dropping the D from it in general, the disorder, and just calling it post-traumatic stress, right? That you don't have to be in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force and experience war to have post-traumatic stress. Like anybody can experience that. But why is it that these two people can experience the same traumatic event, and one of them might say, be very distraught about it and end up in a negative spiral, and potentially, in the worst case scenario, like now they abuse alcohol or drugs, they get in fights with their family or spouse. Then they ultimately like get so depressed and down in a black hole that they feel like there's no solution but ending their life. Yet another person could go through that same thing and say, God, I am so grateful. I have just experienced something so terrible and I have lost two dear people to me. But I can move on from this and put so much good in the world still. I've been given this opportunity to continue. And I want to honor those people by doing that too. And I want to make the world better with this chance that I've been given. Let's study that person and put science behind why that happens for that person, right? So we can have post-traumatic growth, right? So positive psychology and what we do with the Positivity Project with kids and learning about character is not just about response to trauma, but really this idea of like, what is well-being even, right? Like, yeah, like I need to be healthy. Like we do a lot of work with that with Team Artery V. It's the health and wellness community for veterans, right? Like move your body, put good things in your body, drink water, right? Just some real basic stuff that's like brush your teeth, right? Like that's good for your overall health and wellness and well-being, right? But from an emotional well-being standpoint, right? Positive relationships, this idea of connecting with others about their strengths, admiring things that you're not good at as a strength that are, I won't say weakness, but like that other people are better at and valuing that. And then say, what does that bring to a team? And so that's what we're doing is that we're in bite-sized moments, hopefully every school day, 5-10 minutes, talking about one aspect of these 24. And then also this idea of having an other people mindset. P2 developed this based on those words I told you that Chris Peterson boiled it down to. This idea that like other people matter. And if other people matter, then what does that look like in practice? So it means like, especially explicitly teaching to kids, especially in a very busy, distracted world where, cell phones are just everything. And I'm constantly, in another world, like how do I be present and give others my attention? How do I clap for people when they're successful, even though maybe I'm jealous on the inside? How do I support others when they're struggling instead of laughing at them or like, relishing in the schadenfreude of their downfall? Like, how do I be like, yeah, that's pretty terrible. And I've experienced what that feels like too. And, I didn't want somebody coming over and stepping on me after I've already had something, awful happen to me. Right. So these subsets get taught explicitly as well. And so it's through a number of methods and means, but really it's this like, here's this concrete, easy to follow lesson plan essentially that's been built by teachers. And then the teachers administer it and they have tons of flexibility to do it in their own way because they are professionals. And there's a lot of guidance and support offered to them as well, right? And like just as a strategy alone, like we talk about gratitude around Thanksgiving time. Makes sense. We're about to enter, a good holiday stretch. And so we talk about the character strength of self-control this time of year, right? Because there's so much to get off the rails with. Prudence happens when you come back, right? Like this long-term thinking. And oh, by the way, I remember one of my kindergarten teachers being so skeptical, like that we could talk to kindergartners about the word prudence. And yet when she did it, like she'd tell you that to this day, it's like they get it. This idea of like planning and thinking for the long term in their own words. I don't think you can be a leader without being a student of humans, though, right? And this is definitely an avenue to do that. So regardless of even teaching kids, like this has like a whole, how to be and connect with other humans 101 and be a leader aspect all rolled into one.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like to me as I go through life, these are like basic foundational things that I think every human, if they want to excel and be their best selves through their life, they need to understand themselves. They need to understand how to relate to other people. They need to understand emotionally. They need to understand their character, like all these things. To me, it seems like a no-brainer. We should be teaching this to kids early. And heck, 5-10 minutes a day, I feel like it should be 50% of what we're teaching kids at a young age because we go through life and we're not taught these things. What has been the response from schools or even higher up in the political scene to this type of work and bringing this type of work in schools? It's different. It's different than teaching math and social studies and language arts. What's been the response to it?
I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. The growth has been heavy. I think the pandemic made some of the growth difficult. one challenge just for P2 as an organization has been that it's not a big publishing company. Like I mentioned, it's organic and it's grassroots. And so with that comes slower growth because of the way it's happening by word of mouth. But I don't think anybody can disagree with it in many ways, and they don't. I do think like it is more challenging with older kids because their brains are wired to start being independent and not want to listen to an adult, as I experienced the world as a teenager, and as I'm sure you did too, and all of us, right? So yeah, they still, as much as, and this is what I love to be, I'll be a high school teacher, as much as they would like openly like be too cool, or that even makes me sound like an old grandpa already just saying it that way, but like they don't need that, or it's as lame, some older person is trying to get me to do this. Like they yearn for it, right? Like these young people are craving someone to start a conversation with them about what's the point of life, right? And I feel like this generation, particularly like those that are like teens to 20s right now, they have really collectively raised the flag on the like, what's the point question, right? Like, I think that's going back to something I mentioned earlier, right? It's a huge challenge. The mental health epidemic of this age of folks that are teens to 20s, this idea of like nothing matters in some ways, like feeling malaise, is because they don't have their purpose and passion, because they were forced to grow up, I believe, in a system that was all about numbers, results, those things that you mentioned, that like the gut feeling on one side. People disrespect a gut feeling because you can't put numbers on it, right? I'm a data nerd all day, yeah. But people like want to deny that qualitative experience because they don't have hard science to prove it, right? And we have come off of this big data world in so many ways that we have stopped honoring that intuition, I believe, because it gets discredited because I can't count it, right? I can't put a stat to it. Yet, right? There's a knowing in that, and that, like, you can make a research career out of that, right? Because research is not just quantitative results. And so I think all these kids have been turned into numbers, at least in the school systems, because of policies that we decided were important, right? Like we want to perform, we want to count it, but there are a lot of things that are important that you just cannot count, but they're important, right? And I think that like everybody inherently knows that. And that's why there's been such a positive reception to this. I think a lot of educators have finally said, thank God I can start talking to these kids more about just what it means to do life. As much as politically, some people would say, I don't need an educator talking to my kid about what it means to be this. I want to teach them the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, right? Like, but we all want to be guided and, talk to about all the different ways that I could go through life and make sense of it, right? Like, that's what being a mentor literally means. I mean, like, to not tell kids the answer, to let them find it based upon experiencing the world and helping them understand the right questions to ask, right? To then, again, be, like I said, almost 40 and still just pulling on the thread. I got a new question every day. It's like, it never ends, right? And so positive psychology helps us make sense of all that, at least better sense.
I often just joke about, I'm 29 and I'm learning about all of these things in my life that they're not hard skills. It's not math. It's not reading. It's writing. It's all of I'm learning about my emotions and how that affects my physical body and how trauma affects me and all these different things, and about how to relate to myself and understand others. And I'm just kind of like, why do I have to wait until I'm almost 30 years old to start learning about these things? So I just think the work that you all do in investing this into kids from a young age. And I think there's a lot of adults that need it too. But
I'm glad you said that, because if I had my way in my dream, like that, there is P2 for adults. And to tell you the truth, like the teachers personally take a lot out of it. The adults that get to administer these conversations, right? So like I want it for everybody, right? I think that there's actually a huge opportunity in the future for people, like I mentioned my dad retiring, right? Like the man is a workaholic, right? Like he just is, right? Like I'm happy he made it to the finish line. Like hearing your story and what you talked about in your episode about your dad, right? And this idea that like you work so hard for something and you didn't even get to experience it, right? Like I'm like my parents happily booked a trip to like England, Scotland, and Ireland that's happening in like late May, June. And because I was like, do not retire and then sit around the house, like go live your life and like get the adventures that two young kids who got married when you were 20 and 22 and had kids right away, like didn't have, you did for me. Like, don't squander that, right? Like in these, like the retirement planners that call it, they still have go-go years left, right? Like go do something. But I also know that like we've got a huge generation of baby boomers who are about to walk themselves into no purpose. They're going to like actually reach the promised land of like having their careers finish up, and they're going to go to England and Scotland and do these trips, and they're going to come back home, and then they're going to be bored out of their minds and feel like they don't fit in, don't have a purpose anymore. So like this is for everybody, right? Like that Harvard study is so important. This idea that the thriving people in their senior years that were most fulfilled, it all came down to relationships. Like they literally studied very wealthy, like Harvard men type guys in Boston and the very poorest of the poor Boston. Now it's men, it's white men from that time, but they studied them their whole lives. Like the research, if you look that up, was handed over between like 4 or 5 different research leads until recently the Dr. Waldinger. And this idea that you could be a millionaire and be so grumpy and dissatisfied with life and die, and that's it, right? And that the people who were the best off were the relationship people. You could be a millionaire and still be happy and have all these relationships, by the way. But essentially, the theme of that study was that they actively cultivated these relationships, even though they're hard. Everybody has a crazy uncle. Everybody has this person in their family who like you don't. Everybody's got that going on, yet it's still important to lean into that as hard as it can be, because it is literally, the research proves, the number one predictor of happiness, and not just happiness, right? But well-being, right? Because, joy is different than happiness, right? Like this, I feel so internally deep down, like content and happy, right? Like the relationships are the key to that. They just are. Just like you talked about, right? Like you can feel it in your body, right? Like your emotions affect you physically, and you've got to understand how to deal with it. And it literally has to be taught to kids explicitly, because here's what I know of I'm married to a kindergarten teacher wife, right? Like they are being raised by iPads. There's no avoiding it. It's just the kids are exposed to it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm a tech early adopter always, right? I love it. I think it's amazing. But just means that we just can't hope that they're going to go, figure it out. We've got to show them. And then they can, once they know the fundamentals, then they can get a little wild and crazy with the concert here and the symphony. But they've got to know the fundamentals, and then they've got to continue that for life, like you said, because this is a skill that will never end, right? Because you're not ready for the nuances of some of these character strengths when you're in kindergarten, just like you're not going to understand, say, grief and loss as a young person, unless you like tragically experienced it, say like you did, right? Like that I grew up instantly moment, I'm sure that you had, right? To get a call like that. My own mother got that same thing. I never even met her father, So like all of us, right? To have that in our arsenal, being prepared for when that oh crap moment comes, right? Not just for the bad, but then for the good. So when, you walk your daughter down the aisle and she's getting married, that you could cry like a baby because it's that important to you, right? So just like this human business is just never ending and continually should be studied by all of us.
To me, it's just it's an and equation. Let's study our intellectual selves. Let's level ourselves up intellectually. Let's do all of that work, and let's do it on the emotional side of ourselves as well, so that we can connect with people. We can develop these relationships. That seems like to me the best recipe for success as a human being on this earth. So I have a lot of respect for and appreciation for the work that you are doing and the work that all of you are doing at the Positivity Project, because I think like we talked about, it goes beyond kids and it can apply to any human being walking this earth. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing about it today. If people wanted to learn more about the Positivity Project or you or connect with you, what are some ways that they might be able to do that?
Yeah, they should definitely go to the website. So posproject.org, posproject.org. I'm super available on social media. I think on Instagram, it's jmitchell131. It's like all the way back to like my college email assigned address. But Jeremy Mitchell anywhere. LinkedIn, you can find me. I'd love to tell people, if you got a military family member, to go to teamrwb.org. Same kind of thing. Positive psychology to support veterans, right? So Yeah, you can find me any of those social networks. My emails are jeremy.mitchell@posproject.org or at teamrwb.org. Shoot me a line. I'd love to connect, right? Again, this idea of people just like you too, like put the good out in the world, right? Like somebody's got to do it, right? So get started.
I feel confident that we took a step in that right direction today. So thank you for being a part of that.
Agree. Thanks so much, Chad.
Hey folks, as always, thanks for tuning in to this episode of A Level Deeper. If you enjoyed it, could you please take just 5 seconds and leave a rating for the show? That would really mean a lot to me. It helps the show grow, and I'd really appreciate it. And lastly, as a way to say thanks for the episodes and help support me in some of these late night editing sessions, as producing and creating the show is not my job and does not produce me an income, I've got a link to essentially leave like a tip for the show and buy me a coffee to support some of these late night editing sessions. And that is in the show notes. All right. Thank you for being here. Thank you for investing your time with me. And we'll see you in future episodes.